Our first speaker this afternoon is Jillian Spencer, who's going to compare medical systems and systems of change in Australia and New Zealand. Jillian worked as a psychiatrist in Australia since 2007. She completed subspecialty certificates in child and adolescent psychiatry and forensic psychiatry. But unfortunately, she was removed from clinical duties in April this year for raising concerns about gender treatments for children. Welcome, Jillian. We're delighted to hear from you today.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here. Can everyone hear me? Good. Okay, thank you. So regarding this conference, the original plan was for me to interview a New Zealand doctor about the experience of gender care for children and adolescents in New Zealand. Unfortunately, a threatening letter was sent to the College of General Practice in New Zealand, and the general practitioner felt that they had to pull out of fear for their professional registration and career. I think it is the case that the vast majority of doctors in Australia and also likely New Zealand have very serious concerns about the use of the affirmation model. In Australia, there's a handful of doctors who are speaking out about their concerns, but I understand that in New Zealand, doctors are in a much worse position because they're locked into an affirming approach for children by the Ministry of Health guidelines, Te Whatu Ora guidelines and health pathways. So my first slide just gives you a little bit of information about what the New Zealand general practitioner's perspective is regarding gender treatments in children. I asked, from your clinical experience, what proportion of children are identifying as trans in New Zealand? And the general practitioner said that in the catchment of 8,000 people, there were 5 to 10 children and adolescents presenting as trans. And within that catchment of 8,000, that includes all age groups. So there'd be a smaller proportion of people between the ages of 5 to 20. So I think it is something that is an issue. I asked, what sorts of children are you seeing presenting as trans? And the general practitioner's response was, it is usually the slightly quirky kids that are non-conforming to gender stereotypes and never have been, those with mental health issues and anxiety. Some of them have quite severe autism. I've seen a lot of girls who are uncomfortable with their bodies. They often identify as non-binary first. So I guess that sounds to me as it's just the sort of classic group of what we are seeing in the Western world, the adolescent group of kids that are presenting with gender dysphoria. And the GP's perspective on how the children and adolescents are faring after receiving gender-affirming treatments was that they aren't improving at all. They seem to be still struggling with life. So the next thing I want to do is discuss health pathways. This is something that we don't have in Australia. Over the last 10 years or so, New Zealand has been trying to standardise and optimise the healthcare being delivered to patients by creating comprehensive assessment and treatment guidelines for general practitioners called health pathways. These pathways are accessed using a password through a website, and they are specific to a health district so that the doctor is told in the health pathway which hospital to refer to in their area. However, the clinical content of the health pathway for each condition is standardised across New Zealand. And health pathways are relied upon by general practitioners because they come across such a wide variety of health conditions, and so they struggle to keep up with the research developments for each condition. And the health pathways are developed by consulting experts in a particular area, and the information is usually appropriately referenced, but there's no mention of who developed the health pathway, and the pathway is endorsed by the District Health Board. And it is the case that general practitioners in New Zealand have built up a huge amount of trust in the health pathways. And the health pathway will also suggest community support organisations that the general practitioner can recommend to the patient. So New Zealand doctors tend to be enthusiastic about following the advice in health pathways because it gives them security. Being able to say that you've followed the health pathway is perceived as a way to defend against any future patient complaints or legal issues, such as being sued or when facing a coroner. Doctors also feel expected to follow the health pathway advice to the letter by the New Zealand Health Board, and therefore they feel that their professional registration may be at risk if they don't follow the health pathway. The trust in health pathways has built up over the last decade, and it's often the experience of GPs in New Zealand that they'll refer a patient to a specialist but receive a letter back advising them to follow the health pathway. And so the trust and reliance of general practitioners in New Zealand on these health pathways is such that they're likely to be the greatest influence on the care being provided to New Zealand children and adolescents. So what I've done is, to help with this presentation, done screenshots from the health pathway to show you what general practitioners are recommended to do with children and adolescents presenting with gender dysphoria. This slide shows you the first information bubble that you see when you look at the health pathway called Transgender Care in Children. This introduction appropriately acknowledges that children may vary in their interests and activities and may not necessarily conform to gender stereotypes. It is the third paragraph where it starts to become affirmational. It says that there are some children that display persistent and fixed gender incongruence from a young age, and it is likely that these children will need early intervention to support a healthy puberty. This statement is factually incorrect because what we know from the research studies conducted on children with gender dysphoria prior to the use of the affirmation model, so from studies where social transition, puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones weren't used, we know that the majority of children recovered from their gender dysphoria through the course of adolescence and became comfortable in their own body. The health pathway also gives extremely outdated information to general practitioners in saying that puberty blockers are a reversible intervention. Puberty blockers were originally considered to give children time to think. However, what we know from their widespread use is that they prevent the child from recovering from gender dysphoria. So in this way, puberty blockers aren't a reversible intervention because they're the first step on a pathway which has irreversible consequences. In addition, puberty blockers are not reversible in the sense that they permanently alter a child's experience of themselves at an important stage of development. Puberty blockers have side effects similar to the menopause, such as fatigue, hot flushes, weight gain, and mood swings, and they reduce bone mineralization at a time of life when bones should be peaking in strength. And as Simon mentioned, they're thought to have cognitive impacts because adolescence is such an important time for brain development. So the first sentence in this information section on the health pathway says that withholding gender-affirming care is not a neutral option. Sorry, I'm just checking we're on the right slide. Let me see. It must be. Sorry, I'm struggling with the tech stuff. As it may cause or exacerbate any gender dysphoria or mental health problems. This is an unproven statement, and I note that once again it is not referenced. To my knowledge, there's no research study showing that gender dysphoria worsens through the course of adolescence. It's also known that puberty blockers cause a deterioration in mental health for about a third of children, and another third of children on top of that are unchanged in their mental health. For children that start on puberty blockers with mental health symptoms in the clinical range, only about 17% of those children will move into a non-clinical range. So important information that's missing in this introduction to the health pathway on transgender care for children is that we don't know how to determine which children will persist in their gender dysphoria into adulthood. And also there's no evidence of long-term benefit of gender interventions for children and adolescents. This was recently reconfirmed by the third and final systematic review of the evidence, which was released in August 2023 as part of the CAS review in the UK. The systematic review found the evidence base for the outcomes of gender dysphoria treatment in adolescents is lacking, and said that it is impossible from the included data to draw definitive conclusions regarding the safety of treatment. Also missing from the health pathway introduction is a discussion of the ethical concerns of starting interventions in childhood and adolescence, which have lifelong serious consequences, risks and side effects, such that the young person doesn't have the capacity to fully understand these elements due to their age and limited life experience. So this slide shows what the GP is advised to ask the child about in order to assess their gender dysphoria. And I've just included it to show you that there's no particular expertise in assessing gender dysphoria, and it's just based on asking questions about non-conformity to gender stereotypes. In regards to mental health, the health pathway provides false information that is used to frighten parents into taking an affirming approach to their child. The pathway suggests that if parents do not affirm their child, then they place their child at risk of very serious and complex mental health problems and suicide. We know that this information is untrue and that children with gender dysphoria have a suicide risk similar to other children with mental health problems, and that gender affirming care does not reduce their suicide risk. This slide shows that the health pathway also recommends that the general practitioner ask about pronouns, which implies that the social transition of the child is to be supported from the outset. So this health pathways slide advises the GP that it's important to encourage the social transition of children. It also says that using affirming language in socially transitioning children avoids poor mental health outcomes. The study cited in support of this claim was published in 2016 by Christina Olson and colleagues. And the statistical methods used in this study were analysed and discredited by a paper subsequently published in 2018. Olson's 2016 study compared 73 children aged between 3 and 12 who had socially transitioned to a control group of 73 children, and also to another group of 49 non-transgender siblings of the transitioned children. And Olson concluded that there was no difference between the groups in levels of depression and only marginally elevated levels of anxiety for the transitions children. And then she moved on with those conclusions to say that there's clear evidence that transgender children have clear evidence that transgender children have levels of anxiety and depression no different from their non-transgender siblings and peers. And then her conclusion was cited over 370 times in the subsequent 3 years. However, the reanalysis in 2018 of her research, where the authors actually contacted her to get the information that she didn't provide in her article, and she did provide it. So the reanalysis outlines numerous statistical errors and omissions, the implications of which are that the mental health of socially transitioned children was actually poorer than that of the other groups of children. So the transition children appeared to have higher anxiety and lower self-worth. However, it was noted that the measures that Olson had used in her study to assess the children had not been validated for use in that age group of children. And the authors concluded that the issues with her paper highlighted the need for careful examination of statistical research, even when published in a highly regarded medical journal. This slide shows you the information in the health pathway, which continues to encourage the general practitioner to take an affirming approach. It recommends that the GP refer the child for early intervention, and it makes an unsubstantiated claim that such intervention leads to improvement in long-term physical and mental health outcomes. This slide continues the claim that social transition will improve mental health outcomes, and it explicitly recommends that the general practitioner explain to families that the best mental health and physical health outcomes for children are obtained through social transition. However, even the Dutch researchers who pioneered the medical transition of children cautioned against social transition, as they knew it made it harder for children to recover from gender dysphoria. This health pathways slide, sorry, is it blurry on yours? I'm not sure why, but it is it? Oh, thank you. It gives the criteria for the prescription of puberty blockers, which is that the young person's mental health is moderately well controlled, and they are between the age of 8 and 15. And it mentions a hormone readiness assessment as needing to be completed prior to the prescription. This slide outlines that once the puberty blockers are initiated in secondary care by the endocrinologist, that the GP is then responsible for the ongoing prescription of puberty blockers. This slide gives the criteria for cross-sex hormones, which is that the child has had a single psychological assessment of hormone readiness and is considered to have the capacity to make an informed decision to consent. It does give a lower age limit of 16, which is better than in Australia, where we're seeing kids being prescribed cross-sex hormones from 14 years. I did my best to find out what's involved in a hormone readiness assessment, and I couldn't find any specifics. But as Simon mentioned, I noticed that there was an article in the New Zealand Doctor publication which suggests that New Zealand is moving towards an informed consent model where no psychological assessment is required. Sorry, I don't think that clicked over to the new slide. That's the slide. This slide talks about the criteria for a double mastectomy in New Zealand, which indicates that the same psychological or psychiatric assessment which was conducted prior to the prescription of gender-affirming hormones, or not conducted as the case may be, is sufficient to go ahead with the surgery. It says that the surgery can occur once a person is age 18, which again is better than what's happening in Australia, where we're seeing girls in the private sector with private surgeons having double mastectomies from the age of 15. The criteria is that the mental health of the patient must be reasonably well controlled. However, obviously without a psychological or psychiatric assessment, it must be hard to know whether that is indeed the case. This slide shows you that the criteria for genital surgery is identical to that of double mastectomy, apart from also requiring 2 years of hormone treatment prior to it. So this slide shows that in New Zealand, like Australia, it is in the years after 2018 that referrals to gender services have markedly increased. And just at the top there, you can see that there's the health pathway tells general practitioners that there's currently just one surgeon based in Auckland providing genital, as they say, reconstruction surgery in New Zealand, so the waiting list is long. So this is the second part of my presentation, where I want to talk about some of the events that have led to the increase in numbers of children and adolescents wanting to transition in Australia. And my hope is that there will soon be a New Zealand doctor speaking out who will be able to give a presentation about the events leading up to New Zealand's situation. I get the feeling that across the world, everyone's trying to track the events that have led to this problem, and obviously it's interesting to look at local events, but also the impact of international events. So in thinking about the factors contributing to more children and adolescents transitioning, there seems to be a synergistic effect between many factors. In Australia, the idea of gender transition appears to have been seeded by media stories on our national broadcaster, the ABC. And then as more children have heard about gender treatments and as more children have undergone gender treatments, this has built social pressure online and in real life for children to consider whether they also should transition. And the medical gender services have also played a key role in promoting transition in the media. They've been important in promoting a false narrative that children with gender dysphoria are more likely to die by suicide if they don't undertake gender treatments. And medical services have also played down the serious long-term consequences of the interventions and have been very productive in generating clinical guidelines which add credibility to the interventions, even if the recommendations in the guidelines are simply based on the opinions of the people that created them. And these guidelines have in turn been used to convince courts and governments to support gender transition and fund gender services. The medical narrative has also led to reduced parental confidence, as parents are very frightened of losing their child to suicide. And this narrative that transition is life-saving and really without any long-term consequences or any risk of regret has enhanced the capacity of advocates to claim that any opposition to gender transition in childhood must be due to transphobia. And then parents have been weakened by these transphobia allegations, and they fear losing their child if they don't agree to the transition, because their child's being told online that by influencers that their parents are transphobic if they don't allow the transition. So in Australia in 2003, the Royal Children's Hospital Gender Service was established. In 2004, the Australian children were still safe. They're still in safe territory because the family court decided that all gender treatments for children were considered special medical procedures, which is a category that the family court had, which meant that these procedures required court authorisation. And this was because the court decided that gender treatments were non-therapeutic, which meant not clinically necessary, not medically necessary. And they're also considered at this stage to be invasive, permanent in nature, and to hold a high risk of regret. And at that time, a child was only considered to be GILIC competent if they are able to fully understand the nature and consequences of the treatment. In 2011, the WPATH Standards of Care version 7 were released. Also, a key person in the promotion of the affirmation model in Australia, paediatrician Dr. Michelle Telfer, started working as director of the gender service in Melbourne at the Royal Children's Hospital. In 2013, the DSM-5 was released, and they changed gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. It was a name change of the diagnosis. The criteria, when you look at them side by side, are almost identical. However, the gender activists will try to claim that earlier studies conducted on children using the gender identity disorder criteria are now not valid because they aren't meeting the gender dysphoria criteria. And so they particularly wanted to disregard the studies which showed that a watchful waiting approach led to higher levels of resolution of gender dysphoria through adolescence. I think a really significant event in starting the social contagion in Australia and promoting a false narrative about the permanence of gender dysphoria and the suicide risk was the ABC's Four Corners episode called Being Me. And I'll just show you a little clip from that show now.
Campbell was born on the 6th of June 2003, and from a toddler he always preferred girls' things.
Did you ever like boys' things?
Never. My entire life I've used traditional girls' toys.
I love sport. Could not get Campbell into sport at all. We had Lego and Matchbox cars, had no interest in them. As soon as we're home from where we're straight into dress up, straight into either a mermaid tail or a Cinderella dress or fairy wings.
Tried stopping it, but I couldn't really.
Did you fight against it for a little while?
I was trying to. I didn't really know there was anything to do about it. I started looking up things.
Where did you look them up?
Just on the internet. I just looked up what to do if you feel like a girl, and I found all these websites, and they were saying that you're able to get special surgery and that you can actually come out that way. And I found some videos too about some other children feeling that way.
She's here in person tonight, so say hello to Jazz.
It was American transgender girl Jazz Jennings who made the biggest impression.
Thank you so much. Kids and teens out there, I just want them to know that it's okay to step out of your shadows and just be who you are. Just be true to yourself and express yourself.
She had tears in her eyes. Like, she just said, oh, you know, I'm so glad I saw that. Like, it was, she felt less alone, and just came with just a million questions came out of that for her. And she watched it over and over again.
It's made me realise that there was ways to sort of cope.
And before you saw Jazz, did you not know?
I didn't think there was anything to do about it.
What was it like when you realised you could do something?
I felt very happy then. And I told my mum that night.
After the initial high, Isabel started to get very down. Children can be most vulnerable between the time of coming out and getting treatment.
It took 3 or 4 weeks to go through it, but just to see how upset she was, she would come home miserable. I don't see a future for myself. I remember her saying one night.
She'd been crying and we'd been having a discussion, and she was upset so much of the time at that point in time. And she said, I can't, and she's whispered, like, I can't see what the future looks like for me. And that was awful. And that, like, I think for me, that was the point where the confusion kind of melted away a little bit, and you just sort of think, well, God, we've only got one job here, and that is to help her create a future that she can live with, that she can thrive in. And yeah.
How hard would it be if you had parents that didn't support you?
If that actually happened, I'd probably have run away by now or killed myself. Tobias crouches in front of me, his hand on my left shoulder.
Studies show 30% of young people who don't get treatment attempt suicide and 50% self-harm.
The pressure is still there.
Yeah, so obviously that's a devastating situation back in 2014 where the parents really didn't have a hope of getting alternative sources of information that might help them to not follow a medicalised pathway. So in 2016, the Australian Family Court, in a case called Re Darrell, redefined the criteria for a child to be considered to have the capacity to consent to treatment. A psychiatrist correctly advised the court while giving evidence that given the irreversible lifelong nature of cross-sex hormones and the grave possible medical consequences of long-term hormone treatment, I do not believe that Darrell has the competency to consent to irreversible treatment, i.e. Darrell has not achieved an understanding of the long-term medical consequences to understand fully what is proposed. Indeed, given the grave consequences, I'm not persuaded that most minors would be in the position to fully understand the implications of irreversible hormone treatments over the entire lifespan in order to fully understand what is proposed. A person would need to have a fully developed brain and personality, and the psychiatrist evidence was that a person's brain continued to develop until the age of 25, and that their personality may continue to develop even for a period of time after that. However, in resolving this concern about children being unable to consent to the interventions with serious long-term consequences, the judge referred to a 1969 book on the psychology of children by Piaget, which stated that the capacity to make an intelligent choice involving the ability to consider different options and consequences generally appears in a child between the ages of 11 and 14. Therefore, the judge dispensed with the idea that children need to fully understand in order to be Gillick competent, and the definition of Gillick competence was changed to the capacity to make an intelligent choice involving the ability to consider different options and their consequences. 2016 was also a year that the ABC ran a program featuring Georgie Stone. This was part of a push by Georgie and Georgie's family, as well as by Dr. Michelle Telfer at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, to have the family court remove gender treatments from requiring court authorisation. Out of this case, the court decided that authorisation was no longer required for puberty blockers, but was still required for cross-sex hormones, and the judgment was called Re Jamie. So I'll just show you a little clip of this program now.
Well, hi, my name's Georgie Stone, and
And we just finished the Christmas tree here. And
Once Georgie was diagnosed, I was relieved in a way. I think we were all relieved because finally we knew this was it. So we just embraced it.
And look up there, there's your camera.
Oh, hi.
So if ever you're talking, don't look at that.
All you want as a parent is to have a happy child and for that child to be themselves.
The weirdest faces you can. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Remind me of Ollie. I loved once. I think that's my favourite thing that I've seen you do.
To know that Georgie wanted to kill herself if she couldn't become who she is, you just do anything to help them. You just do. See, some people say, oh, you know, you guys have been so heroic or whatever. But it's not heroic at all. It's just you're just doing your job as a parent.
Maybe don't come because it's awful.
I thought that I was leaving the brother behind until I learned that I didn't lose my brother. I always had a sister.
How do you feel about your brother becoming a girl?
Well, at first I felt confused. So I didn't say woof and nothing because I was confused. And
Transition for Georgie actually was a very gradual thing. So it wasn't like one day we were dressing her like a boy and the next we were dressing her like a girl. It was a process over a long period of time. And that process needed to take place slowly so that everyone around her could catch up.
At the age of 10, the endocrinologist discovered that Georgie's testosterone had gone through the roof. She was entering puberty. And so it was urgent that we got on to puberty blockers. So what do you think is going to happen after you have the puberty blockers?
well, then I won't go on to a boy. I won't get shoulders and double. I really don't want to get a hair chest.
Georgie, like all children at that time, were required to go to the Family Court of Australia to get permission to start on puberty blockers. Puberty blockers are medications that essentially stop the production of estrogen or testosterone, depending on what biological sex you are. So for Georgie, going on blockers meant that her face didn't masculinise, her voice didn't deepen, and that she wasn't at risk of growing facial or body hair consistent with a masculine appearance. For Georgie, there was a race against time. It really was an emergency.
I was at the point where I was thinking I might go overseas and try and access some drugs illegally, bring them back, because if Georgie went through puberty, it would have been terrible. We would have failed. It would have been something that we would have regretted for the rest of our life.
I rang around various places and eventually found a group of lawyers who agreed to do it for us, which was a huge relief, because had we not found them, I don't know what we would have done.
When I was 11 and when I was granted puberty blockers by the Family Court of Australia, it was a massive victory, not only for me but for Australia, because I was the youngest person to be granted permission to have puberty blockers.
Yeah, so what's interesting in Australia is that the push for childhood medicalisation of gender dysphoria has come from these people who are quite, in their nature or in their history, performative. So Georgie's parents, both of them are theatre actors, and Michelle Telfer, the doctor, she is an ex-high-level gymnast, been to the Commonwealth Games, etc. And Michelle Telfer, the doctor's husband, is a musician and performer. So it's the creatives in Australia that have often driven this push. So, to go back. So in 2017, the Australian Family Court in a judgment re Kelvin decided that children no longer needed court authorisation for cross-sex hormones. And this judgment occurred because the gender doctors in court emphasised that gender treatments were the best of care available and were life-saving, and that there was a very low risk of regret. And the court had obviously been shown the draft guidelines created by Michelle Telfer called the Australian Standards of Care, because the court referred to them in the judgment, although they weren't formally published until 2018. And in 2018, it was game over in the family court when they decided that even gender surgeries did not require any court authorisation. So 2018 was when the Australian Standards of Care were officially published by Michelle Telfer, the Royal Children's. That was actually also when I think the Australian Academy of Paediatrics published their guidelines.
Well.
So in terms of resistance, this started in Australia in 2019 with a doctor petition, and also the Australian newspaper started publishing numerous articles on concerns about gender transition. The petition website was shut down by activists after receiving the signatures of 260 doctors within 3 days. This prompted the health minister at the time, Greg Hunt, to ask the Royal Australian College of Physicians to consider if there was any utility in holding an inquiry into gender treatments for children. Unfortunately, the Royal College of Paediatricians wrote back saying that they did not think an inquiry was required and that such an inquiry would cause harm by raising the issue publicly. Meanwhile, the ABC was still, I won't play this clip because they're still promoting gender ideology. This is a show called Not a Boy, Not a Girl, about non-binary children, featuring 4 females who, one of which appears to have ASD, 2 of which are theatre types, or 3 of which are theatre types. So they're quite a interesting and beautifully quirky group of females. Sorry, I'm just running out of time, so I'm just going to. And so this is the Australian newspaper in 2021 was rebuked for its coverage of the gender issue and of Dr. Telfer. I'd better just finish there because I'm aware that we've only got a couple of minutes to go. So I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Jillian. Thanks, Jillian, very much for that. And there's been a question go up. Is there a summary anywhere of your excellent counterpoints with references to the health pathway, for example, that parents could give to their GPs?
No, I haven't done that. It's something that this health pathway is something that I've only just come across when I was thinking about what to do after the GP was no longer able to do the interview with me. So it's actually only something I've come across in the last 2 weeks. But I fully agree that New Zealand has to get this health pathway changed, because it's the way that the GPs feel safe and comfortable delivering care, and departing from that is a massive risk for them. So it seems to me that it's got to be a real focus for gender critical people to change that. And so I'd be happy to help out.
Good to know. And then there's also an interesting question that you may or may not be able to comment on. Has anyone in Australia or New Zealand examined the environmental effects of endocrine disruptors or issues with pesticides, particularly glyphosate? Have you looked at this side of it at all?
No, I haven't looked at that. It's sort of on the fringes of medicine, and no one sort of in the mainstream is looking at it. But I'm, gosh, with how much we've been betrayed by the affirmation model, it's really hard now to trust what's considered mainstream and what's not. So I'm open to thinking that it could be an issue.
Yeah. Thank you especially for sharing the video clips, which really help us get inside some of the very difficult issues about informed consent, about the bioethical principle of non-maleficence, of first do no harm, and the precautionary principle of looking for the least risk outcome. As you've thought about these issues, people on the gender affirming care side also appeal to some of the same principles. How are you sorting all of this out in your head?
Yeah, well, I've come down rather firmly on one side in that I do think that it's unethical to transition children. I don't feel that they have the capacity to understand the lifelong implications of the pathway that they're embarking upon, and I do feel that we have to give them their best chance of recovery from the gender dysphoria, which is to go through puberty. So I've come down very heavily on that side. I know that from the other side that their most convincing point of view is, well, it's helping some children. I feel nervous about that because I feel like that's short-termism, in that we all know about, what the pathway is when you feel like you've stumbled upon a great thing, like a low-carb diet or something. But, I'm not comparing that, but I'm just saying we know that it's human nature to get quite on board with something, and that could change over time. And so when I see these positive stories of children who have been assisted, I do wonder about their long-term future. And I feel like it's likely that quite a proportion of them will pull away from the transition and have some regrets and may go through really significant distress. So I don't really feel confident in that argument that they make. People say, well, if it's such an issue, where are all the distressed people out of Holland, etc.? But I think that it's quite hidden from view. We don't have a lot of people coming out saying, oh, I got transitioned as a child and I feel great about it. I've hardly ever seen that. I've never seen that, I think. But I have seen people saying I was transitioned as a child and I feel bad about it. So, but I suspect there's a whole lot of people on who that we don't hear about, and so we just don't know the answer to the long-term outcomes. The research hasn't been done, and we don't get enough information just through general media channels.
Yeah. Thank you, Jillian. It's been a delight to have you present to us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.